I thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing, for your work on rooting out waste, fraud, and abuse in the federal government. I can tell you one of the issues that I do hear about most frequently from my constituents are the physical and economic danger that are posed by the Brightline expansion into the Treasure Coast. There are numerous issues that deserve scrutiny when it comes to this expansion. On February 15th, my Committee of Transportation and Infrastructure had an opportunity to ask the National Transportation Safety Board, also the Federal Railroad Administration, about many of these issues, and the FRA indicated that they are also very concerned about these safety issues, including the deaths, some of them by suicide, that have been as a result of this train. Now, let me just start by saying I am a supporter of private activity bonds. There are numerous important projects, good projects that Congress has specifically intended to provide the option of private activity bonds for. There's a list of them up on the board right there: airports, docks, wharves, mass commuting facilities, facilities for furnishing water, sewage facilities, solid waste disposal, residential projects, furnishing electronic and energy and gas, heating, cooling facilities, hazardous waste facilities, environmental enhancements of hydroelectric generating facilities, and qualified public educational facilities, green building and sustainable design projects. There are two additional categories. The first is high-speed intercity rail facilities, which Congress defines as a railway using vehicles that are reasonably expected to be capable of attaining a maximum speed of 150 or a speed in excess of 150 miles per hour. In other words, if Brightline wants to use tax-exempt bonds, they have to have the capability to run their trains in excess of 150 miles per hour. But they don't, so Brightline has instead sought to circumvent this congressional intent by claiming that they qualify as a highway. We'll get into the theory of this claim in this hearing, but I do think we can all agree that based on any common understanding of the word highway, this train does not meet that definition. I do believe that if Congress had intended to provide private activity bonds for a passenger train traveling 80 to 110 miles per hour, as Brightline does, then Congress would have laid that out. They would have just said so, and any other interpretation is an affront to the American taxpayer. And in that, I thank you for the time to speak, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back. Thank you all for being here. Mr. Goddard, I thank you for taking the time to be here for this hearing. Just with a couple of for-the-record questions. Do the all-aboard Florida trains currently operate in speeds of excess of 150 miles per hour?
No, they do not.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Berthy, did the Department of Transportation approve $1.15 billion in private activity bonds to all aboard Florida as a qualified highway or surface freight transfer facility?
Yes.
Thank you. I like to think that if Congress wanted to fund trains through the private activity bond process outside of those that are high speed, those in excess of 150 miles per hour, they would have put that into the list of 15 eligible projects for private activity bonds. Mr. Berthy, Section 142, Title 26, it does define eligibility for private activity bonds. A qualified highway or surface transfer facility is any surface transportation project which has received federal assistance under Title 23. So I want to ask, did any Title 23 money go to the All Aboard Florida project?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. In the application from All Aboard Florida that the Department of Transportation received, All Aboard Florida indicated that over 2012, 2013, and 2014, Title 23 funds were used on the corridor. That was after the announcement from All Aboard Florida.
The corridor or the All Aboard Florida project?
I'm sorry?
The corridor being FEC corridor or the All Aboard Florida project specifically?
The corridor on which the All Aboard Florida trains will run.
So if All Aboard Florida did not specifically receive funds, I would wish that the department would withdraw their award letter for private activity bonds. But I would ask, was there actually monies distributed or deposited to All Aboard Florida specifically, that project? Were there monies distributed into an account for a surface transportation project to All Aboard Florida?
The Florida Department of Transportation manages Title 23 funds in the state of Florida.
So are you saying, not to the best of your knowledge, were dollars specifically put into an All Aboard Florida account? They went to FDOT, Florida Department of Transportation.
We are not aware of any funds going to a All Aboard Florida account. However, the application which the Department of Transportation reviewed did indicate that funds were used by the Florida Department of Transportation from Title 23 on the corridor on which the all-aboard Florida trains run, enabling it to be eligible for assistance under private activity bond statute.
Thank you for that. And I think this is an important point of what we're getting at here, and it has a very broad implication for what goes on with private activity bonds across the breadth of this country. This is the problem. Congress has given a list of projects to provide private activity bonds to. As it relates to rail, Congress said very specifically high-speed rail over 150 miles per hour. You said, for the record, that's not you. We're not disputing that. Nobody is. So what we're using here is this kind of doublespeak that I think often ticks people off, where everybody is labeling this train something that it's not. We're saying because it once in one section of a corridor, not even the same project, had some infrastructure upgrades done to the project, that by that rationale, an intersection was fixed somewhere on the rail, that an entirely new project is subject to being eligible for private activity bonds. And I think that's what we're getting at here. I would like to get to something else very quickly here. Mr. Goddard, All Aboard Florida's CEO Mike Renninger testified in June of 17 on T&I committee that I sit on. He testified to me that All Aboard Florida is not publicly funded at all. It's completely an investment of private sector capital. However, Brightline's private activity bond application from December of 17 reads, the project has received financial assistance under Title 23, that's the federal assistance, and eligibility for private activity bonds under Title 26 mandates that the financial assistance is in fact federal assistance. So my question would be, when the CEO, Mike Renninger, testified before T&I in that time, was he lying to me when he said that that the Brightline project hadn't received any federal funding, or was there a lie to the Department of Transportation on the application in saying that private activity bonds are eligible because they have received private assistance? That to me sounds like two completely different answers.
Yeah, no, he did not lie. He did not lie to you. That funding was relative to safety improvements.
And with that, my time has expired, and I will yield back. Thank you. Thank you again, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Goddard, does FEC have agreements in place, or does Brightline have agreements in place with Indian River County, with Martin County, with St. Lucie County?
FEC.
Is FEC Brightline?
No, FEC is not Brightline.
So then, is there new upgrades to these crossings that has to occur as a result of the Brightline crossing, not as a result of the FEC project?
So I think it's important to clarify, Congressman, that All Aboard Florida owns the perpetual right and permanent easement to run passenger service on the FEC railway between Miami and
FEC is not Brightline, though.
That's right.
And the agreements are with FEC.
That is
correct. The new infrastructure is as a result of the Brightline project. The new expensive infrastructure that Mr. Reingold's county will have to pay for the upkeep of.
It's shared infrastructure.
Got it.
It's shared infrastructure.
And on all of the safety upgrades that were conducted throughout the entire corridor of train, I do read on all of them, it does say FEC crossing, FEC crossing, FEC crossing for everything. And so it's in that. I want to get to the truth in testimony for what I was able to question your CEO on transportation and infrastructure, or the truth on the Department of Transportation application, and get where we left off before. As I said, All Aboard Florida CEO, Mike Renninger, he testified June 23, 2017 in Transportation and Infrastructure to me to a question that I asked, that All Aboard Florida is not publicly funded at all. But we've been having this entire argument throughout this on whether there is even $1 of public funding that has gone to this project, which would allow it to qualify even as a highway or a freight transfer facility. And we've gone back and forth. Is there $1? Is there not $1? Is there a limit to it? The testimony to me on transportation and infrastructure is not publicly funded at all. It's completely an investment of private sector capital. So I will ask one more time. Your answer before was, he did not lie to me. That was your answer before. He did not lie to me when he said it's completely private. So on the application, was there not truth on the application where you're saying there was public funding used, which would enable you to get these private activity bonds?
The funding that was received through Section 23 was for what is now the shared infrastructure, and it was intended to improve crossings and the safety of crossings throughout the corridor.
So you maintain there is public funding in this?
There has been public funding granted to the corridor.
So it was not truthful when you testified to me on transportation and infrastructure?
Well, again, this was, so there's a distinction between, I suppose, I'm not sure of the timing of the funding. Honestly, Congressman, I don't know exactly when the timing was. I'd need to get back on you. But back to you, whether the funding preceded the inception of All Aboard Florida or not, I'm not certain.
Please get back to me on that. Mr. Berthe, I want to get to you. So it sounds to me, and I heard you use the word indicated, probably at least 3 or 4 times as we were talking about the application of FEC, Brightline, All Aboard Florida, whichever company it was. And it sounds to me as if from their testimony thus far, the Department of Transportation did base the eligibility of the decision for private activity bonds on All Aboard Florida's self-reported acceptance of Title 23 funds. That whole argument of whether there was federal funding or not federal funding, whether there was truth or not truth in the testimony on transportation and infrastructure. So did the department investigate All Aboard Florida's claims in their application at all?
The department does review all components of the application, including the actual use of Title 23 funds that a sponsor claims.
Does the department determine FEC to be Brightline? Are they the same company to the department?
That is not a consideration that the department makes, and given pending litigation on that issue, I cannot comment further.
So the department does not look at whether one company received federal funding and whether a completely separate company is applying for private activity bonds. That's not looked at in an application when one company is claiming that they received federal funding.
Unfortunately, Congressman, I cannot comment further on that given litigation that's pending.
Okay. I would hope that you could comment on this, being that this is the primary concern of how we're determining whether somebody is eligible for private activity bonds. The department does seem very unsure whether All Aboard Florida actually received Title 23 funds or not, and as we said, that's what the application is entirely based on.
So,
Mr.
Berthe,
hold on, just if
the gentleman will yield for just a second. So, Mr. Berthe, are you suggesting that you don't know whether you evaluate that or not?
I'm not suggesting that. I'm suggesting that the overlap between FEC and All Aboard Florida is the subject of litigation. I've been instructed by our counsel to not comment on that matter. All
right, so let me ask you this. His question is more generic. Do you typically evaluate whether one entity and another is one and the same? Do you typically do that? Which would not speak to the litigation at bay here or at bar. I mean, do you typically evaluate that?
Well, obviously, all applications are very different, and so it would be on a
right. So either it's typically evaluated or it's not, because all applications are evaluated differently. But you would say, do you consider two different entities, to Mr. Mast's point, as one, typically? In all your reviews, obviously, if you're prepared for litigation, you've already looked at this. In all of that, would you typically do that?
Well, certainly, Congressman, Mr. Chairman, we do very significantly take a look at the applicant that is requesting private activity bond allocation. But with regard to whether or not one entity is judged versus another, I mean, I think it's difficult to answer that question on an overarching basis. I think it's very situational.
Well, can you confidentially get your counsel, and certainly with the DOT's help, respond to this committee in 30 days with specificity? I see your staff's nodding yes. Is 30 days enough? All right, thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to complete my line of questioning with this, and I'd like to go to Chief Wooters for a minute here. In all of your time in looking at safety issues, have you experienced the push on the county, or have you heard, Mr. Rangold, the push on your county to say that because there is uproar about the 32 trains and train horns blowing 32 times in the backyard of everybody or in the downtown of everybody, have you been approached by the Brightline project about the fact that there can be quiet zones, or that they can be quieted, or they can not blow the train horn?
Thank you, Mr. Congressman. Yes, we have been approached about them. At this point, the county's position is we don't feel that it's a good thing. We recognize a significant change in the train speeds and frequency through the area is something that the community needs to have time, if you were to come to understand how it works, much like Congressman Posey had mentioned in the incident that happened on the train that you were on. They have to come to understand those changes in speeds affect the way they make decisions. And we don't think that quiet zones are an important thing to put in. We think that all the safety features should be working as normal, not agreeing to those quiet zones.
Mr. Rangel, do you have a comment?
We have concerns with the quiet zones as well. As we've seen already in South Florida, there have been significant accidents and incidents already, and we certainly will take the consideration of quiet zones seriously, but we are very concerned about the safety of this project, and thus are not jumping instantly into that issue.
Mr. Goddard, you did mention quiet zones briefly in your written testimony. Is the possibility of quiet zones something that you push on the localities or encourage to the localities?
So the quiet zones are completely at the option of the municipalities through which we travel.
In order to avoid outrage of a train horn blowing at every intersection in an area, have you encouraged the city of West Palm Beach or any other cities to consider permitting quiet zones?
No.
Okay, I don't know if you're aware, but this goes to the point, and I'll finish with this. This goes to the point of the continued cost of this project, not just at the local level or potentially the state level, but also at the federal level. Just last week, the mayor of the city of West Palm Beach, she was in my office, and she was very specifically asking me that the federal government pay for increased infrastructure at every intersection because they permitted every intersection as a quiet zone as to avoid the outrage in their community of this train traveling through it 30 times, and they now wish that the federal government will pay to get those quiet zone permitted intersections up to a higher quality because of the deaths that have occurred. This is in the area that his train is running, and this is just, in my opinion, another example of where the federal government potentially gets on the hook for the cost of this line, not just from where FEC or Brightline is asking for dollars, but where the cities and the municipalities come and ask for those dollars as well, especially in the result of safety concerns. In that, Mr. Chairman, I thank you for the time today, and thank you for the hearing. I thank all of you for your testimony to me. Thank you.